Okay, great. Hello, everyone. This is Christina Jang from ITDP, and welcome to our webinar today. Before we begin, there are just a few things to note. This webinar will be recorded, and both the recording and PowerPoint will be available on our website within a week. To interact with us today and Eileen, please submit questions through the Q&A function, which is at the top or the bottom of your Zoom screen. We also ask you to refrain from using the chat box. As we go through our presentation today, we encourage you to submit questions throughout the presentation. Again, thank you all for joining our webinar titled Getting to BRT, an Implementation Guide for US Cities. BRT has proliferated all over the world since the 1980s, and more recently, it has been pursued in cities across the United States. ITDP developed a guide focused on issues specific to the US context, and today's webinar will highlight some of the salient lessons from the guide, drawing from case studies in Albuquerque, Hartford, and Richmond. Today, our presenter is Eileen Kerrigan, a consultant with ITDP's US program. Her research and consulting work focuses on design, implementation, and impacts of BRT. In 2008, she supported the implementation of Johannesburg's via BRT, and subsequently studied global experiences with BRT as a senior associate at WRI. She has also co-authored research on the political and technical challenges of BRT implementation, as well as the social, environmental, and economic impacts of BRT. So now I'll hand off the screen to you, Eileen, and you can feel free to begin your presentation.
Thanks, Christina. Let's see. Great. Well, good morning or good afternoon to everyone. I see from some of the attendees online, you're not all, some of you are from time zones far ahead. So good morning or good afternoon, whatever the case may be. I'm excited to be here today and spend the next 40 minutes or so talking with you about bus rapid transit in US cities. Over the last few months, I've been working with Michael Kodransky, ITDP's US director, and Julia Wallace, the Boston program manager, both of whom are on the call today. We've been developing a BRT implementation guide for US cities. We'll release it soon and are excited to preview some of the findings for you today. The guide and today's webinar are organized into 3 parts. First, we'll highlight the status of BRT and US cities. We'll take a deeper look at 3 case studies, and finally summarize some of the lessons we learned about how US cities can successfully implement a BRT corridor. As I said, I'll speak for about 35 or 40 minutes and we'll have time for questions at the end. So these 10 US cities have succeeded in implementing 12 BRT corridors. Albuquerque, the 11th city, is preparing to launch the 13th corridor soon. So first of all, you might be asking, why did I include those particular corridors and not others that you might be familiar with? When identifying the set of US BRT corridors for this research in the guide, we used a very specific definition of BRT, which distinguishes it from bus priority lanes or better bus improvements. We utilized the BRT standard's definition of bus rapid transit. The technical committee of the BRT standard includes a group of internationally renowned BRT engineers, designers, and planners, which is convened by ITDP. These experts have agreed on the following definition of BRT. It's a section of road with dedicated bus lanes at least 1.9 miles or 3 kilometers long, and it's served by 1 or more bus routes. So that's the definition we've used in our research in our guide. There's an important distinction to be made between the BRT corridor infrastructure, which we've defined here, and the interlining bus routes that may operate along that corridor. Furthermore, the BRT standard identifies 5 basic BRT elements, which are essential to defining a corridor as BRT, and help differentiate it from standard bus service or even better bus improvements, as I said. The 5 BRT basics help to eliminate common sources of bus delay, be it from congestion, conflicts with other vehicles at intersections or the curb, and delays from passenger boarding and alighting. And all of these help to increase efficiency and lower operating costs. So dedicated right-of-way for the BRT vehicles, preferably bus lanes that are physically separated from mixed traffic, helps reduce delays from congestion. Aligning these bus lanes to the center rather than the curb helps reduce conflicts from other vehicles along the curb or at intersections. Giving BRT buses traffic signal priority and restricting left turns across the BRT lanes help reduce intersection delays. And station platforms that are level with the bus floor and offboard fare payment systems allow reduced boarding and alighting times. The BRT standard defines BRT specifically and more narrowly than other institutions. For instance, the FTA here in the US defines BRT more broadly as a high-quality bus-based transit system that delivers fast and efficient service. It may include dedicated lanes, busways, traffic signal priority, offboard fare collection, elevated platforms, and enhanced stations. So it's a bit more, it's a broader and less specific or less restrictive definition than we've used. And these different definitions of BRT have led to some confusion. We've included in the set of US corridors only those that meet the BRT standards definition of BRT, those that clear the threshold of basic BRT requirements. Other corridors currently in development may be certified as BRT once they're completed, but we refer to them here in the webinar and in the guide as bus corridor projects, just for clarity. So back to that list. Here is that list of 13 US BRT corridors again. 2 notes, only the design of Albuquerque's ARC corridor was certified. It's not yet operational, and so the certification will be reassessed once operations begin. And Fort Collins Max corridor and the South Miami-Dade busway haven't been formally certified by their BRT committee, but based on ITDP's preliminary assessment, they do meet the basic definition of BRT, so we've included them in this set. There's been a steady expansion of BRT in the US over the past 4 decades. Pittsburgh launched our first US corridor in 1977, its South Busway. Over the next 27 years until 2004, there were only 2 new corridors that opened, the South Miami-Dade Busway in 1983, and Pittsburgh added its second corridor, the Martin Luther King Jr. East Busway in 1983. Beginning with LA Metro's Orange Line in 2005, we saw more rapid expansion occur over the subsequent 13 years. Which brings us to today, where we count the 12 corridors totaling 73 quarter miles. And with Albuquerque, we'll have 13 corridors and almost 82 miles. The 12 operational corridors transport between 3,300 and 24,000 passengers per weekday, or a combined 142,000 passengers each weekday. There are numerous positive impacts of these BRTs that the cities have experienced over time. The BRT corridors have reduced travel times and boosted ridership on the corridors. They've helped reduce greenhouse gas emissions and attracted significant corridor investment in TOD. As I've just shared, there are great examples of BRT in the US. So why write this guide? ITDP's US program wants to see more cities benefit from high quality BRT. So we created the forthcoming guide to help cities get to BRT. Implementing large public transit projects such as BRT, it's complex. And what these cities have achieved was certainly not easy. Their experience is invaluable for other municipalities who are considering introducing a BRT, especially in a US context. We think that sharing insights, lessons, and some examples and anecdotes from these cities' experience with high quality BRT corridors will help streamline the implementation process for subsequent cities and accelerate the growth of BRT in the US. As I mentioned, we selected 3 case studies for a deeper look at what it takes to complete a BRT corridor. Hartford's CT FastTrack, Richmond's The Pulse, and Albuquerque's soon to launch ART. These 3 corridors were selected because they're among the highest rated BRT corridors in the US. Hartford is a silver rated corridor, Richmond recently received a bronze rating, and as I mentioned, Albuquerque's design was rated gold, which will be reassessed once it's operational. These 3 corridors are in different urban contexts. CT FastTracks operates along a rail easement and former rail corridor, while Richmond and Albuquerque's are urban arterials. And these BRT corridors offer insights into recent trends that we are interested in exploring. My colleague Julia and I have visited the 3 cities, toured the corridors, and spoke with some of the planners, advocates, and officials involved. and I want to thank all of the people who took the time to meet and speak with us. Combining the site visits with desktop research, we compiled detailed case studies, highlighting their design characteristics, funding sources, operations, and some of the unique challenges that they faced. I'll share some of the highlights of each of the cases here now. So starting in Connecticut, Connecticut's CT FastTracks is a state-owned BRT corridor, which was nearly 20 years in the making. The project was prioritized by the governor, not only for its transit benefits, but for its potential to spur economic development. After the recession of 2008, CT FastTracks was a shovel-ready infrastructure project that promised to bring jobs and economic development to the state. The 9.4-mile silver-rated BRT corridor is a dedicated busway. The BRT service between New Britain and downtown Hartford launched in March of 2015 and currently carries an average of 18,000 passengers a day. CT FastTracks uses a direct service model, where some bus routes use the busway and the BRT stations, and then continue off the busway and serve bus stops, curbside bus stops in this case. The BRT stations have bypass lanes, which allow local and express services on the corridor. CT FastTracks fares can be paid with a smart card and a soon-to-be-released mobile app. They also use an interesting fare capping policy, which ensures passengers pay only the lowest possible fare. Some of the 4 municipalities along the corridor have aligned the BRT investment with zoning changes to encourage TOD, and we're starting to see new developments that have taken advantage of these changes and development bonuses. Half of the CT FastTracks guideway is along a former rail right-of-way, and the other half is built on a permanent Amtrak easement. Converting rail corridors to BRT busways is a common approach we see in US municipalities. In addition to Hartford, you'll find converted or shared rail corridors in Pittsburgh's 3 busways, Los Angeles's Orange Line, South Miami-Dade busway, and in Fort Collins. Utilizing a rail right-of-way ensures minimal delays from congestion or other vehicles, and it can be quicker and sometimes more politically feasible than acquiring on-street right-of-way. Yet there are potential downsides. The rail corridor can act as a physical barrier to pedestrians, and the surrounding land uses and development may not be very walkable or transit-oriented. Coordinating with rail agencies and operators adds more complexity to the BRT project management, and several of the BRTs operating along rail corridors have experienced higher than usual traffic crashes caused by vehicles not yielding at rail crossings. Some have adjusted their BRT operations or signal timings to improve safety, sometimes at the detriment of BRT speeds. Finally, CT FastTracks cost more than $500 million to implement at the time, and helps illustrate why busways tend to have higher capital costs than other BRT corridors. This chart shows the total capital cost per mile, including fleet, adjusted to 2019 dollars to facilitate comparison. The US corridors per mile cost generally range from 4 to 82 million, while the busways, highlighted here in the lighter yellow or lighter orange, they started at 13 million and increased to 82 million per mile. This higher busway cost is partly attributed to the need to purchase a right-of-way or an easement, and extensive civil engineering like tunnels and retaining walls. This was certainly the case in Hartford. Hartford's busway included new overpasses and significant amount of retaining walls. Pittsburgh's West Busway, for instance, which tops out at $82 per mile, included the rehabilitation and widening of a 130-year-old tunnel. Second, our case studies moved to Richmond, Virginia, where project partners succeeded in implementing the region's first mass transit corridor. The Greater Richmond Transit Company, or GRTC, launched the Pulse BRT in June of 2018. The BRT route serves one of the region's densest residential and commercial corridors through downtown Richmond. Part of the route includes a 2.6-mile bronze-rated BRT corridor with center running lanes and stations. Elsewhere, the buses operate in curbside lanes or in mixed traffic. Implementing the Pulse was a multi-jurisdictional effort. The transit agency, GRTC, and the state developed early plans, while the state oversaw construction. The BRT corridor passes through several blocks of historic commercial buildings in downtown, and so the State Historic Preservation Department was an important stakeholder. Other vital partners included the city of Richmond and Henrico County, and major institutions along the BRT route. 2 local hospitals signed a joint naming rights sponsorship for the Pulse, very similar to the naming rights sponsorship for Healthline in Cleveland. And the transit agency reached an agreement with Virginia Commonwealth University, or VCU, whose campus is served by the BRT corridor. And through the agreement, the faculty and staff of the university are allowed unlimited transit rides. There was some criticism of the proposed Pulse BRT that it didn't serve the lower income and minority communities in East Richmond very well. And this led to a broader discussion in the region about the effectiveness and equity of their existing transit service. Ultimately, the city and GRTC decided to redesign the bus network to increase frequency and coverage across the area. GRTC launched its new BRT corridor and a redesigned bus network on the same day, which I think is a remarkable feat. This simultaneous launch of the BRT and the redesigned network has led to a 17% increase in bus ridership in the region. There are some interesting and unique design features of the BRT Pulse stations, which I find interesting. The back of the stations is formed by a glass panel printed with a large station area map. QR codes at each station location on the map link to information about local destinations. And if you can see in that photo that the station pylon that says Main Street Station, next to it, there's a vertical strip of lights or LEDs, and these illuminate from bottom to top to visually illustrate when the next bus will arrive. The Richmond case offers an opportunity to talk about off-board fare collection and proof of payment, some recent challenges with proof of payment. The Pulse uses an off-board fare collection and proof of payment system, and it's been criticized recently. Now that the BRT is operational, several Richmond City Council members have characterized it as an honor system that allows people to ride for free. Critics have suggested eliminating the proof of payment and off-board fare collection to reduce fare evasion and increase revenue. I think this serves as a reminder to cities who are thinking about implementing BRT, the importance of emphasizing to their stakeholders the importance of off-board fare collection in reducing boarding and alighting delays, and really delivering that high quality, frequent, rapid service that defines BRT. Like Richmond's The Pulse, most of the US BRT systems rely on proof of payment rather than a payment barrier at stations such as turnstiles. To ensure that people aren't, quote, riding for free, fare inspectors are often employed to check passenger tickets. While this is very common, proof of payment systems are not flawless. The fare inspection aspect of proof of payment systems introduces equity concerns. Using uniformed police officers to inspect passenger tickets can be considered an aggressive tactic that introduces policing and the potential for confrontation into a transit system. This could deter passengers of color, immigrants, and other vulnerable populations from using the BRT. Police enforcement of fare evasion was also ruled unconstitutional by a Cleveland municipal court in 2017. Throughout its system, including the Healthline, Greater Cleveland's RTA used to deploy police officers to inspect passenger fare cards and issue citations. In her decision, the judge said that stopping a single passenger was okay if there was reasonable suspicion that they had evaded the fare, but subjecting an entire bus to inspection by law enforcement amounted to illegal search and was unconstitutional. After the decision, Cleveland's RTA eliminated off-board fare collection on the Healthline and required passengers to pay at the fare box in the front of the bus. This has introduced delays and led to ridership declines. I don't think scrapping off-board fare collection and the benefits that it presents to BRT passengers is necessary. On the other hand, or alternatively, the solution is implementing more equitable fare policies, such as deploying fare inspectors who aren't law enforcement, perhaps through a community enforcement program, and decriminalizing fare evasion altogether, which some transit agencies in the US are beginning to do. And our third case study takes us to New Mexico and Albuquerque. About 18 years ago, BRT was first suggested along Albuquerque Central Avenue. And now the city has constructed a 9-mile ART corridor, or Albuquerque Rapid Transit Corridor, which has helped transform the auto-oriented historic Route 66 into a more walkable, transit-oriented street. Central Avenue is an important transit route through Albuquerque, carrying many of the city's transit trips. With the median aligned dedicated BRT lanes about 90% of the length of the corridor, ART is expected to reduce travel times and boost transit ridership. It also has some really interesting design details. The modern stations were designed to evoke movement along the corridor, and their roofs are made out of tensile fabric, very similar to the roof of the Denver airport, if you happen to know it. The award-winning ART brand reflects the cultural history of Route 66. Like the famous byway, the BRT aims to connect different neighborhoods along the corridor. The ART logo, with 3 circles spelling out ART, is inspired by a vintage motel sign on Central Avenue. And neon lights along the edge of the station roofs, along the outside of the ART sign, as well as along the outside of the original electric buses, called to mind Route 66 neon signs. The station architects created a miniature model of the ART stations that they could take to public meetings, as well as a really interesting virtual reality station that could help the public envision what it would be like to wait for a BRT bus in a median station. Median stations are new to Albuquerque, and there were some concerns that people might not feel comfortable waiting in essentially the middle of the street. And so the virtual reality station allowed passengers to become more familiar with what that would be like. Like most transformational infrastructure projects, ART faced some obstacles. They had vocal opposition, including 2 lawsuits. And the project spanned 2 mayoral administrations, which introduced some challenges in project implementation. Nevertheless, the city succeeded in constructing 9 miles of dedicated bus lanes and 19 median stations in 2018. The infrastructure is ready, and as soon as the buses are ready, the service will launch. Pedestrians walking along Central Avenue already benefit from streetscape improvements that were completed as part of the BRT construction. And a few new infill developments are beginning to crop up along the corridor. The full benefits of Albuquerque's infrastructure investment won't be realized until the ART service begins. The configuration of the ART lanes varies along the length of Central Avenues and is an interesting configuration. There are 2 segments of bidirectional lanes, a shared median BRT lane, which is used by 1 bus at a time. The other bus is held with the traffic signal. And this will require optimizing signal timing to minimize BRT delay and preserve the 7.5-minute headways. Bidirectional lanes are also utilized in Eugene's MX and Fort Collins MAX. Albuquerque also has an additional innovation. They call it a reversible BRT lane. In the morning peak, I think it's eastbound buses utilize the median bus lane, while the outbound bus operates in mixed traffic lanes, and the reverse happens in the PM peak. The bidirectional and reverse lanes reduce the total lane width needed for the BRT. And this was helpful where Central Avenue narrowed or where on-street parking needed to be preserved. Albuquerque is also the epicenter of the recent electric BRT fleet trend. A little background, the original 60-foot articulated Albuquerque buses seen here were BYD battery electric buses. The city claimed that during testing, the buses did not meet their battery range specification or the distance the buses would need to travel between charges. Albuquerque reported other performance and safety issues with the buses, which the manufacturer BYD disputed. Eventually, the lawsuit was settled in court. And Albuquerque has returned the electric buses and have turned to finding a replacement. They were unable to find a US manufacturer who would provide an articulated battery electric bus to meet their charge specification. And so they ordered replacement clean diesel buses from New Flyer. This only happened in 2018, once sort of towards the end of construction. So there was this additional lag time that put the launch of operations on hold. Indianapolis also ordered BYD electric buses for their forthcoming Red Line bus corridor. After encountering performance and battery issues, Indigo worked with BYD to develop a solution. They've installed 3 inductive charging points in the Red Line bus lanes. And so the 31 electric buses will recharge their batteries en route. This appears to sufficiently extend the battery range. And so Indianapolis is poised to launch the first all-electric BRT in the US. Both of these cities and others experience with electric BRT fleets, I think reveals that the articulated electric bus market specifically is still maturing as manufacturers try to meet cities' ambitious performance targets. So with our remaining time, I'd like to speak about 3 of the steps a project sponsor needs to take to successfully implement a BRT. We talk about several more in the guide, but wanted to highlight these 3 today. Setting the table, or identifying and including the vital partners and decision makers in the project development, arranging funding for the BRT project implementation, and building community support for the project. Successful BRT projects require agreement and coordination between myriad stakeholders about issues from the use of the right-of-way, infrastructure design, choice of technology, fair policies, and fair and multimodal integration. Making the necessary decisions and agreements in a timely way requires having the right parties at the table from the start of the project. Critically, this needs to include the owner of the right-of-way and any agency with authority over the corridor infrastructure, including underground utilities, which is especially important if parallel utility upgrades are planned, which often happens as a BRT or along with a BRT corridor construction. Interagency agreements such as an MOU can help formalize cooperation and responsibilities among partners. Coordination on multi-jurisdictional projects is more complex, requiring additional time and efforts. BRT corridors that cross jurisdictional boundaries are situated along state-owned corridors or rail rights-of-way, typically require more extensive interagency coordination and integration. As I mentioned, Connecticut DOT owns the CT FastTrack infrastructure, and they had to coordinate the project with the 4 municipalities that the corridor passes through, as well as the rail authorities. Furthermore, the state DOT doesn't have jurisdiction over the streets in downtown Hartford, and so they had little leverage in a decision to preserve on-street parking instead of providing dedicated BRT lanes through the downtown Hartford loop. There's also a disconnect between the city-owned traffic signal hardware and the state-owned BRT system that would benefit from TSP in downtown Hartford. Another example is in the East Bay, San Francisco East Bay, Oakland's bus corridor project along International Boulevard, where the city of Oakland and Caltrain, the state DOT, own various parts of the right-of-way, and AC Transit, the regional transit operator, is overseeing construction and utility upgrades. An extra step is often required for AC Transit to get permits and other approvals from the city of Oakland, which can introduce some inefficiencies. Across the bay in San Francisco, their Van Ness bus corridor, the planning of that corridor was led by the San Francisco County Transportation Authority, whereas the transit operator, SFMTA, is overseeing construction. That route is part of US Highway 101, which is a state-owned route. And so the corridor designs required Caltrain's approval. At the time, the state DOT didn't have a bus or BRT corridor design guideline. And so a lengthy process of discussing and negotiating corridor design details resulted. Secondly, I want to talk about arranging funding. The combined capital cost for the 13 US corridors was about $2.2 billion, and 60% of that was funded with federal sources. Each of the projects relied on some federal funding. Most used an 80-20 split, so 80% federal funding and 20% state or local. Los Angeles was an outlier, using only 9% of federal funding, as well as some state funding and local sales tax revenue to fund their orange line. Other state and local funding sources that US BRT projects have used include bonds, payroll taxes, and gas tax revenues. Interestingly, Fort Collins Downtown Development Authority contributed tax increment finance, or TIF, revenue towards their max BRT. And the Cleveland Clinic contributed several millions of dollars towards the Healthline corridor improvements. Beyond this set of US BRT corridors, some bus corridor projects in development now have relied on some interesting funding sources that I wanted to highlight. The East Bay bus corridor project through Oakland is utilizing Bay Bridge toll revenue, as well as some state cap and trade funding. While this San Francisco's Van Ness improvement project, their funding includes $5 million in development impact fees from a new medical center situated on the corridor. And also, by tearing down its elevated central freeway, San Francisco freed up some developable land parcels downtown, and about $12 million from the sale of those parcels supports the Van Ness corridor improvement project. The 13 US corridors relied on about $1.3 billion in federal funding. More than a third of this was from the New Starts funding. Small Starts provided 16% of the federal funding. It's worth noting here that FTA makes a distinction between a fixed guideway BRT and a corridor-based BRT. Fixed guideway essentially operating in a physically separated, dedicated bus lanes for the majority of its length, whereas a corridor-based BRT can operate in mixed traffic or curbside lanes. And only fixed guideway BRTs are eligible for new starts funding, whereas both fixed guideway or corridor BRTs are eligible for small starts funding. In this chart, the other FTA category includes a fixed guideway modernization funding that both Hartford and Cleveland used, as well as regional surface transportation program funding that LA used. And the flexible Federal Highway Administration funding category includes CMAQ funding, or congestion mitigation and air quality improvement program funding. Now, 2% of the federal funding came from build grants, which are formerly known as Tiger grants. And while it's only a small percentage of the total capital costs or federal funding, it funded Richmond's Pulse BRT. I did want to mention it because it has a unique characteristic. It's uniquely flexible. Build grants can fund multi-jurisdictional and multimodal projects that are hard to fund with other sources. While states and transit agencies are typically eligible for new starts and small starts, build grants can fund almost any public entity, including cities. So our third step in implementing BRT, wanted to talk about cultivating public support. Introducing BRT, especially along urban arterials, requires reorganizing, and reallocating street space. And naturally, there'll be resistance to such a change. This change causes concerns. But being aware of the potential criticisms of a BRT project and these public concerns about changes to the right-of-way, a BRT team can be proactive in trying to mitigate negative impacts. The communications teams can better articulate the justification for and the benefits of the BRT, and ultimately help cultivate more understanding and support for the project. So I want to highlight 3 common points of opposition to a BRT corridor. We heard it in the case studies, and a lot of the other systems in the US have surely felt some of these, heard some of these challenges. Stop consolidation, parking changes, and construction impacts. Stop consolidation. When a BRT replaces existing bus service on a corridor, some bus stops might get eliminated to ensure the BRT service is frequent and rapid. Stop consolidation may increase walking distances for some passengers, which is particularly challenging for people with limited mobility. Eliminating a stop from a neighborhood may inadvertently suggest to members of that community that the BRT is trying to bypass them, that the new transit system is not for people like them. This is a criticism Albuquerque and Richmond faced, and that the East Bay Bus Corridor project is facing now. Stop consolidation should be addressed sensitively after extensive community input and discussion. Parking changes on the corridor is another common criticism from businesses and residents alike. Reducing on-street parking or criticisms about reducing on-street parking is nearly universal to BRT projects. Richmond offers some inspiration though. The transit agency and the city of Richmond developed a parking management plan, a block-by-block plan for addressing changes in on-street parking, as well as commercial loading. They created maps and flyers to showcase available parking that was located off of the Broad Street BRT corridor as well. They provided these to businesses along the corridor and made them available to the public on their website. The third common public concern about BRT projects is the impact of construction, especially on businesses. The expectation is that the BRT construction will make moving on the corridor unpleasant, deterring customers from patronizing the corridor businesses. There's no way around the construction, but BRT teams can let people know what to expect during the construction phase and try to support businesses during the construction. A couple of examples from Albuquerque. The art marketing team, led by a local firm called Studio Hill Design, created a campaign, 66 Reasons to Love Central Avenue, which promoted businesses along the corridor during construction. And the city of Albuquerque created a small business assistance program to help some mom and pop businesses weather the construction. They provided some technical support. In Oakland, the Bus Corridor Project's business assistance program included not only technical assistance, but also some financial support that businesses could use as well, some small grants to make some capital improvements or other changes that to their business model that they would help them weather the construction. Municipalities considering a new BRT corridor should anticipate concerns the community may have, especially these three: stop consolidation, parking, and construction, and think about how the project team might address these concerns. Cultivating broad support for the BRT early on is crucial for success. A lot of different strategies can deploy. I won't talk about them all now, but I wanted to share a few examples and some interesting anecdotes from the case studies. Walking the corridor and engaging door to door with every residence and business is a very labor intensive, but also a very effective way to get the word out about the BRT. This approach was used in Richmond and Albuquerque, and it helped that they secured funding to hire dedicated staff to canvass door to door. Through other outreach efforts, it's important to engage diverse stakeholders: youth, seniors, people with disabilities, lower income, higher income communities, business owners, and others. Many projects have even convened a citizens advisory committee to represent the community's needs and opinions to the project. Civic advocates can play a vital role in making the case for BRT. If one doesn't exist, establishing a transit advocate before the BRT corridor planning advances too far could be a positive step. These advocates can turn out their members or constituents at public meetings and help build diverse grassroots support. The project sponsor should make it easy for advocates to support the project. For instance, they can proactively prepare consistent branded information, talking points, and graphics for the community advocates to disseminate. One anecdote from Richmond was that the communications director in Richmond created an extensive frequently asked questions about the BRT project and shared it with the advocates and community organizations, and who found it enormously helpful and saved them a lot of time. Richmond's RVA Transit is one of those transit advocates. They have their roots in poverty alleviation. And one of their board members is a respected reverend with close ties to both the church communities in the region. RVA Transit promoted the Pulse BRT as the first step towards a better regional transit system. And they were instrumental in turning out diverse support at for the Pulse at critical city council meetings. The photo is one of those meetings. And finally, BRT is still a new concept to many Americans. So a lot of people might not fully appreciate what it is you're proposing to build. Back in Hartford, Connecticut Dot found that their outreach was more effective when they focused less on telling people what they were building, the BRT infrastructure, and more on what people could do with the BRT. For instance, they visited senior centers and talked with residents about how they could use the BRT to reach medical appointments or social engagements downtown. So I've talked for the last 35 minutes or so about the status of BRT in the US, shared some highlights of the 3 case studies we developed, and touched upon just 3 steps that cities need to take to get to BRT. I want to close by highlighting several bus corridor projects. We don't know yet if they'll be rated as BRT, but I wanted to highlight them because I think they're worth watching for some interesting reasons. As I mentioned, of course, we're still looking forward to the Albuquerque launch. I understand that the ART driver training is underway, so hopefully we'll see news of the launch of operations soon. In Indianapolis, the Indigo's Red Line is slated to open Labor Day. It's a very long corridor, 13.5 miles. I think that would there's one other that's longer, maybe that's the Orange Line. And just over half of the corridor is center-aligned lanes and stations. And as I said, it includes the first electric BRT buses. San Francisco's Van Ness Corridor and the East Bay Corridor in Oakland are currently under construction. They're both very urban corridors in dense cities, and they include significant portions of center-aligned dedicated bus lanes. It will be interesting to watch the construction wrap up and the operations launch. And then here in Colorado, where I am, the city and county of Denver is planning a center running bus corridor on its East Colfax Avenue, where currently the daily ridership of bus routes on the corridor is as high as some of the highest capacity US BRT corridors now. It's a very high ridership corridor, and the fact that they're talking about dedicated BRT infrastructure and a center aligned corridor, I think it makes it a really interesting corridor to watch. So potentially some more dots to put on our map, and I'll leave it there. Turn it over to Christina. We have about 20 minutes. We can answer some questions if you have them. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Eileen. I'm just going to reshare my screen. I hope everyone can see that okay. So I'll start with a few questions that were entered here in the Q&A. The first one here is there any indication of TOD adjacent to BRT stations? So perhaps it could be from one of your case studies.
Absolutely, there are. Too numerous to name here. I can recall in the Hartford case study, we talk about it's a mixed income housing development that is adjacent to one of the CT FastTrack stations. It opened recently, and I talk about some of the funding sources that they used. A really interesting mixture of income housing, as I said. It's mixed income housing and it's a mixed use development as well. Also in Albuquerque, as I said, you'll surely see more once the operations have launched, but there are some projects. I talk about one in the case study. It's on the west end of town, I think in Old Town, very small residential unit development. So I forget off the top of my head, but 500 or 700 square feet, I think, small units, 1 bedroom, sort of efficiency apartments, very, very low parking provided because it's essentially right outside a BRT station. And many others, ITDP has published other work on looking at TOD generally and TOD on BRT corridors. There's a lot of, it's a bit older, but a lot of extensive data out of Cleveland that and there's good numbers quantifying some of the TOD investment that Cleveland has seen on its Healthline as well.
Great, thank you, Eileen. I'm also going to address a question that was sent to us via email from the city of Eugene. Can you describe the clear differences between BRT and a frequent transit network and the value of investments that rise with the level of BRT?
Sure, thanks for that question. I think that's an important distinction, as I mentioned. So I want to say two things. One is, yes, there is a distinction. And as we talked about in the BRT definition, what we expect to see on a BRT corridor are those 5 elements: the dedicated right-of-way, the preferred center-aligned stations, offboard fare collection, level platforms, intersection treatments. And you often won't find those infrastructure treatments on a bus priority corridor or even a bus network improvement. So there really is an infrastructure component of BRT that you won't see in other investments. I think a second point that's worth making is they're not mutually exclusive. So as we saw with Richmond, the city there launched both a BRT corridor and a network redesign, which looked at frequency, places where the network needed more frequent service. And so you absolutely they can exist in the same city. There are other cases where Indianapolis is planning 3 BRT corridors and has also looked at reordering or reorganizing their bus network. LA has a process going on now where they're looking at how can that relate to a citywide reorganization of bus transit. And so BRT absolutely can relate to it. I think that BRT makes sense on certain corridors and not others. Because it's designed to, those 5 elements help to minimize those common sources of delay. If you have a corridor that isn't experiencing those kinds of delay or doesn't have high ridership, perhaps BRT is not the right solution there. It's not an appropriate solution for every corridor. So some distinctions. And can you repeat the second part?
The second part of the question, the value of the investments rising to the level of BRT when a city rises to the level of BRT.
I'm not sure I understand that.
Yes, I'm not sure if they were looking for an overview of economic development. I do think it's hard to capture that in the context of Eugene, but that was the second part of the question.
Okay. Well, as I said, we showed there is a range of investment that can for a BRT corridor, as we showed, depending on the infrastructure requirements, and also we've seen a various data from different cities, Eugene, Cleveland. Some of these new case studies have recent data as well, showing what's the economic impact as a result of that BRT investment, and it's there and it's significant. So we can follow up with more specific facts if needed.
Great, thank you. I'm going to bundle some questions we received about electrification over email and through the Q&A today.
Okay.
So can you just emphasize in your research what you have seen with electrification infrastructure, or what has been explored for BRT systems, and some of the, and you already went through Albuquerque, but some of the opportunities and challenges that they've faced so far?
Sure. So we did talk about electrification in the case of Albuquerque and touched a little bit on Indianapolis. I think in terms of infrastructure, my understanding is there's an additional requirement, which is charging infrastructure. And so as far as I understand in these cases that we looked at, providing that charging infrastructure, well, that was an agreement between the city and the bus manufacturer, but in some cases, the bus manufacturer provided that charging infrastructure. And in the case of Indianapolis, it was they actually partnered with a third party who provided those inductive loops that were embedded in the lanes. And I believe that there's two options. You can charge sort of at the end of the service day, or you could charge inline en route, as Indianapolis is doing. So the cost of that charging infrastructure and sort of the procurement agreement, who's going to provide that, needs to be sorted out. And I think that as we've seen, the big challenge right now remains the battery charge and the range. And so it remains to be seen whether the manufacturers are able to meet the city's ambitious goals. I think we're seeing a lot of cities that are wanting to move towards electrification, and it's a question of, for a 60-foot articulated BRT bus, whether the batteries can meet those ambitions. I don't know, Michael, if you have anything you want to add to that.
No, I think you covered it all.
Okay.
Great, thank you. So Eileen, I'm gonna skip down to a few questions below from Jay Monty. He says here, it appears some of the center running BRT systems shown here still have stations and platforms on the right-hand side of the bus, splitting the station into two locations on opposite sides of the intersection. Presumably this has to do with bus fleet requirements. Can you share any insight about these situations and the challenges related to this?
Yes, that's a good question and a good detail to point out. So this is a configuration that you'll see in several places. So you have a center running BRT lane, but the stations are to the right of that lane. And so the passengers board through doors on the right-hand side of the bus. So the bus boards inside or operates inside of the station. And so you end up splitting a station platform into essentially an inbound and outbound platform. I think that decision can be made for several reasons. We heard from folks in San Francisco on their bus corridor, the Van Ness bus corridor project, that there was a desire to not have a subfleet for the BRT corridor, meaning if they had gone with a center station platform, center lanes with a center station, a single platform for inbound and outbound directions, buses would need to have left-hand doors, and the existing Muni fleet doesn't have left-hand doors. And so they wanted to be able to use the existing low floor Muni buses on that corridor. So that was partly driven, there may have been other factors, but partly driven by a fleet desire to preserve or not have a subfleet. And then it can, I think there can be some cases where the width of the right of way may help to have a split station, and you can fit it into a narrower space in that sense. It does increase. It may increase some construction costs. You're essentially, in some cases, building double infrastructure, two station roofs, two platforms, things like that. So there may be some cost increases to splitting it, but then some savings in terms of the right of way, the width, and avoiding a subfleet.
Great, thank you, Eileen. I'm gonna jump back up to the top of the Q&A again. One question here is, did any of the projects also try to integrate a bike lane on the same street?
That's a very good question. Not the 3 case studies that we looked at. There are instances of multi-use trails or bikeways parallel to a BRT corridor. So at least for a portion of the FastTracks segment or corridor segment, there is a multi-use trail that was constructed in parallel, as well as in Los Angeles, they have a bike path along the Orange Line. So I didn't encounter on-street bike lanes. Certainly in Albuquerque, there's not an on-street bike lane along Central Avenue. At least the majority of it. I take that back. There is a small segment where there is an on-street, at least there's an on-street bike lane and in some cases sharrows, but it's for a very short segment. I could point that person who asked that question to Portland. They're developing a bus corridor. I don't know the details enough to know that, and it hasn't been completed, so we wouldn't certify it as BRT yet, but it's at least a bus corridor, and they're doing some interesting designs where they're integrating curb bulb outs, platforms, if you will, with on-street bike lanes. So that might be an example that they look to.
Great, thank you, Eileen. The next question here is from Matthew Cole. Do you have any data from the examples you've referenced to evidence modal shift, namely from cars to bus, that they've brought about?
Off the top of my head, I don't recall whether I have that specifically for any of the cities. We have ridership data, and in most cases we know the transit ridership on the corridor before the BRT, and then there's after ridership data. I'm not certain that we have a modal shift for any of them, but I could certainly I can follow up if there's something that I can share.
Great, thank you. The next question here is a little bit further down in the Q&A from Raphael. Could this guide be implemented in mid-sized cities in the US, such as Lafayette, Louisiana, or Raleigh in North Carolina? And if so, is the BRT system a viable option for these cities? What factors must be considered before implementing a BRT system in a city like this?
I think the question was, is it appropriate for smaller mid-sized cities? Is that correct?
Yes.
I would say it could be. One of the considerations when looking at the case studies was the size of city. And so, we have some smaller size cities included, where we also at the higher end of the spectrum is, we have Los Angeles, we have, projects coming online now and some of in San Francisco, bus corridor projects in San Francisco and Oakland. Seattle is doing a lot of work with bus corridor projects, but the BRTs, it's a range of, 100,000 to a couple 100,000 to, million, smaller size cities. It certainly can be appropriate. We've seen case studies where it's made sense. I think it depends on the corridor, as I said, where you have the high transit ridership or travel demand, where people are, and if those people are experiencing those common sources of delay, and it would make which would make sense to introduce a BRT that could reduce some of those delays, it may make sense. I think the other aspects of the guide are certainly applicable. The funding piece, I talked about who is eligible. There's other funding that I didn't list called very small starts, which is for very small cities. So that, I think the funding piece is certainly relevant, as is the outreach and the idea that you need to coordinate and who needs to be at the table. So a lot of those recommendations and lessons would apply. The question would just be from a technical standpoint, is there a corridor that makes sense for BRT that has that demand? Those characteristics that BRT would benefit. And I would point you to a lot of ITDP's other technical guides. The BRT planning guide has deep technical information about choosing a corridor and understanding some of those choices about travel demand and demand profiles and where it makes sense to put a BRT. And also the BRT standard has some, would provide some guidance on the benefits of introducing those different elements.
Thank you, Eileen. And I do want to mention there are a wealth of resources, including the ones that you mentioned, and I'll make sure to include that in my follow-up email to all of our attendees today.
That's great.
The next question here, it's a bit in the middle of the Q&A from Rosie. Do you have any success stories where proposed BRT lines have consolidated local bus routes along with stop consolidation?
That's a good question. Yes, so Albuquerque will be a success shortly. The BRT, the ART is replacing or will replace. The Central Avenue has local service as well as they call express service, or I believe it's called Rapid Ride. And so the BRT will consolidate some of that service. Some will remain, but and then some of those curbside bus stops have been consolidated into the ART or replaced by the ART stations. So that's one. There are many others that, a lot of instances we see the corridor replaces the existing service and consolidates it. In Richmond, my understanding of part of the reason for the bus network redesign was the Broad Street corridor where the BRT, the Pulse corridor operates. It had something like 14 bus routes that were all vying for the curbside bus stations. And so part of the goal of the network redesign was to streamline and simplify the Broad Street corridor to ensure that the Pulse buses, which do operate off the BRT corridor curbside various points, that the BRT buses could operate efficiently and preserve the headways that they needed. So there are examples, and there's others in the guide. And the planning guide talks about the technical aspects of stop consolidation and route consolidation as well.
Great. Thank you, Eileen. So we only have 2 minutes left, and I will just use one last question here so that we don't go over time. Are BRT development projects common in areas that have strong multimodal transit networks, such as light and heavy rail? To what extent does overall transit ridership change when transfers are available from BRT networks to other existing modes?
That's a great question. So the first part about multimodal networks, yes, they do. You can look at Pittsburgh. They have BRT corridors and light rail. I believe parts of, maybe it's the West Busway, uses the same corridor as the light rail. Cleveland has rail transit. LA has rail transit. Vegas has. So there's lots of examples where they coexist. I'm not sure that I have great data off the top of my head of transit transfer information and how. The previous question about mode share, I don't have that readily available, but we could share it. But I would say that most of the cases we looked at saw the introduction of the BRT had a positive benefit on transit ridership, at least on the corridor. And I would think as you build a network and you facilitate those connections and improve accessibility, you would see transit ridership might rise across the system. And we can provide more specific information if needed.
Great. Thank you so much, Eileen. So I am going to go ahead and wrap up the webinar. But first of all, thank you for a great presentation and also giving
Thank
us
you.
all a teaser of the
Sure.
implementation guide to come. We really appreciate you walking through the high level takeaways and also the challenges that these cities have faced in these case studies. And then more importantly, thank you to all of our attendees who came to our webinar today. You will receive the PowerPoint and the recording in a follow-up email from me, as well as some other key resources that were referenced during today's session. And overall, please look out for an email once the guide is launched. We will send the link directly to your inbox so that you could get a special preview before everyone else.
Thank you very much, Christina.
Great. Thank you, Eileen. Everyone take care.